And we're back. We have Aaron Kubal for round two. It's been about almost exactly a year. Aaron, thanks for coming on again. For people who haven't listened potentially to the first episode, would recommend it, but can you just give another intro and background on yourself?
Yes, thank you, Christopher, you sweet angel. I'm Aaron. I'm a chiropractor. Man, and you can push back on this. I think I've earned the right now to add educator to my title, as I launched my telehealth course I'll get into all that. So yeah, I'm a chiropractor. Graduated, man. I've been in practice almost 4 years now. So God, that is crazy. I graduated about 4 years ago and I started my own practice right away. Kind of a different kind of chiropractor in the sense that I don't crack backs or even see people in person. I've been fully remote with just my online clinic for 4 years now. Still have never seen a patient in person professionally, which is, like I said, kind of a different way to do things, I guess. But and that's all just born out of me getting into chiropractic, not really knowing fully what it was. Just I had a good experience with it growing up, and then I went to school, and then it wasn't what I thought it was, and then I had to pivot a whole bunch of different ways, and I was teetering on dropping out, and then someone talked me into staying, and then I did stay, and then I kind of made it my own with remote care and rehab, and then that lining up with COVID and kind of forcing us into remote care for a while was just kind of the perfect timing to sort of normalize all of that. So I segued that into a fully online practice. Been running that for 4 years. I think most people know me from social media. It's a lot of calling out misinformation throughout chiropractic, physical therapy, fitness, all that kind of stuff, as well as trying to promote guideline-based care. I spend a lot of time on all of that. And then, let's see, 3 years ago, something like that, I launched my online telehealth course just to teach other people how to do it, because I just looked at the opportunity and said, I don't really know anybody who's spent their entire career only doing telehealth. So I feel like I'm a good person to put this out. And it did better than the course itself has done, better than I could have ever dreamed. I've got people who have taken it now just all over the world across all different professions. So that turned out great. And then last year, I started my next kind of teaching endeavor with my mentorship program for clinicians and students. And that has spiraled into something bigger than I ever could have imagined. We've had, like, our last several cohorts have been physical therapists, occupational therapists, chiropractors, primary care physicians, trainers, strength coaches. We've kind of covered the whole spectrum of different professionals, all wanting to, update their approach to care and follow something that might be a little bit more coherent with the guidelines and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, I'm a chiropractor, but I'm a lot of other stuff too at this point now. And so it's been a really weird, windy road. I don't know if that's a good intro or not. I don't know if I missed anything.
That was a great intro. I was going to ask after that, what has changed or evolved for you since we talked last over the past year, and you already alluded to it. So congrats on all of your pursuits and endeavors going well.
Yeah, dude, I appreciate it. I even want to ask you too. I don't know if you've noticed, I don't know how much you actually pay attention to other people's content and stuff online. Because like at this point now, I just post. I don't really scroll anymore or look at anything anyone else is doing. But I even at this point, like the way all the social media content started, it was all patient facing and it was all like mostly lay public responding. But now it even feels like my demographic of audience has even shifted to it's more clinicians who are interested in the stuff I'm posting and saying. So now even the content I make has kind of shifted to where I'm starting to think maybe I need to make more clinician facing stuff, especially doing more teaching and things like that. So it's been a weird evolution because my initial thought was, with all the calling out misinformation, a lot of clinicians are already set in their ways and kind of have made up their minds about how they're going to do things and treat people. So I'm not going to try to change their minds. I'm just going to go straight to the public with my content. And that was how all the social media stuff had began. But now it feels like it's kind of shifting to now I have more clinicians listening to me than probably lay public. So maybe there's further shifting in that as well to go along with the teaching. I don't know. But yeah, everything's always just changing in little ways, it feels like, all the time, the longer I'm in this.
Yeah. And it's probably not like one's better or worse. It's just your audience has shifted and you maybe are hitting more total people and having a bigger impact just based off of if you're educating more and more clinicians, they're having more and more reach with their
Right.
patients. So yeah, it's great, man. And I'm excited to see what things look like for you moving forward. But to the reality of you only seeing patients remotely and that's all you've ever done, I
Mm-hmm.
think people question a lot of like, what does that actually look like? And we discussed that a lot in our first episode. So we're going to be a little bit more zoomed in today on specific treatments and a specific treatment, all on neurodynamics and neural mobilizations. And you made a post, or it was maybe just on your story a few weeks ago, saying that you really don't prescribe those. And I thought it would be a great discussion for us to have because they are very popular. They're very easy to teach. They're easy for patients to use. And I wanted to hear your perspective on potentially your hesitancy with it, or maybe the claims and what you do or don't do. So let's start out with Aaron. What can you just provide for people maybe who aren't familiar with it? What is or are neurodynamics and neural mobilizations?
Yeah, so and I love that we're talking about this too, because it just fits into the broader bucket of radicular pain and radiculopathy and nervy type stuff, which I've posted many times. I feel like is so frequently, like, wildly mismanaged across the board. So I think zooming in on this topic and then branching it to the broader conversation of just radicular pain and radiculopathy itself, I think is really good thing to talk about. I don't think we can talk about it enough because, again, I do feel like there's just a lot of goofy stuff that goes down with it, and people don't. It's hard to manage too. So I think a lot of people feel like their hands are tied and don't really know what to do. And I think that's part of the popularity of nerve glides and neuromobilization. So it is all just like it comes. I don't know that it comes from Michael Shacklock, but I know that he has definitely popularized it with his neurodynamic systems, or NDS, whatever the acronym is. And the basis around it being he prescribes low load movements that follow the path of specific nerves, with the idea that the theoretical underpinning behind all of it is where a lot of my problem with it stems from. And it's all based around, okay, that nerve is sensitive. We're theorizing that it's sensitive because it's not moving the way it should through its sheath or through, whatever limb that it goes out and supplies. And maybe it's stuck or adhesed. Like, you hear adhesion a lot, like neural adhesion a lot with people who are doing neurodynamics. So we need to move it, or quote unquote nerve floss it or nerve glide it, to get it unstuck. And that will then lead to pain relief. And I think we'll get into it, I'm sure. But I think the biggest problem, at least the most glaring one right off the bat, it really lines up with the problem we see kind of across the board in our respective professions, which is we like to grab all these theoretical underpinnings with different interventions and really hang on to that. And we tend to focus more on the theoretical underpinning with our rationales before we ask the question, is this even effective or more effective than other options? And I think that's probably where our focus needs to go. But when the mechanism that's proposed and not necessarily proven makes sense, we just have a real long-standing habit of falling in love with certain interventions because those mechanistic theories make sense to us. And I think that's kind of what's happened with nerve glides too. Yeah.
Yeah, and what is tough is so much of musculoskeletal rehab and medicine, there isn't a ton known on the true mechanistic effectiveness or efficacy. So it is claims that don't have a ton of backing. For people that either maybe have done these on their own or their clinicians that prescribe them, can you just touch on like the really common things that people probably have done or have seen, like nerve glides, nerve slides, maybe just touching on more specific neurodynamics?
Yeah. So, like, the sciatica, I mean, like, I've seen different iterations and variations of it. I was about to get up and try to demonstrate them. I'm not going to do that, but I've seen different iterations, and a lot of it involves just, like, if it's the sciatic nerve, for example, doing repeat movements that follow the path of the nerve with the lower limb, and you're just moving basically just that nerve or following the path that it follows, and you're doing movements that go in and out of its respective range of motion. And the same with, like, you see it a lot with carpal tunnel too, where it's like, I mean, like my clinician who I was under in my internship back in school would do a lot of like, it looks like he's doing like belly dancing or some shit, like having people, this kind of stuff, and like doing like the owl hands and going like this and that kind of stuff. Just any movements that mimic the path of the nerve and would, in theory, if the nerve was stuck, floss it back and forth so that it would then get unstuck and glide more smoothly or whatever. And I've seen it adapted and applied to carpal tunnel and using the upper limb to do this stuff, and sciatica. And like, those are probably the two most common that you'll see. And it really just involves repeat movement of those limbs back and forth, like you're plantar flexing, dorsiflexing the ankle, or you're flexing and extending and deviating the wrists and doing things like that. Like it's just a lot of that stuff. Those are the most common ones I see. I don't know if there's any other common ones that you've seen as far as application most commonly.
Yeah, that's pretty much it. I don't prescribe them typically in practice, but in our clinic, there's quite a bit of people that do. And funny enough, we're having a Shacklock course in the next few months. So I'm very curious as to how that will go and what they prescribe or what that looks like. But it's the typical like sitting at a gym table, almost like a slump type position. And you're just modifying cervical head position, lumbar thoracic, and then leg extension, plantar flexion. You're just, in the sense, what they're saying is like you're creating stretch to the nerve and then coming out of the stretch and creating tension. But again, your concern or hesitancy is the rationale as to what they think or is described as what's going on. What about, from your understanding, what is the research supporting for neurodynamics? What do we know or don't know?
That's where it gets sticky. So like, I know I've cited a review from 2017. I think the last name on it is Basson or something like that, if you know off the top of your head. But when you look into a lot of the papers referenced, and when you look into a lot of Shacklock's publications specifically that he'll probably cite during his course, like it does seem like maybe nerves get adhesed or get stuck, and like adhesions happen. They happen with all kinds of tissues throughout our body. But the problem is, although that happens, it seems like he kind of took that observation that nerves maybe get stuck or tissues get adhered and whatnot, and then took that to say, this movement will be extra effective at unadhering or getting those things unstuck. And like, my contention with that is, I don't think there's any reason to believe that to me, every movement is neurodynamic, right? You can't move a part of your body without moving all of the nerves that are running through that part of your body. So I don't think we have to floss along the path of the nerve to move it. And I don't know why just general movements or just moving your body, even in just normal movements in day-to-day life without the intent of moving or gliding nerves, I don't know why those wouldn't get nerves unstuck or unadhered any less efficiently than some sort of movement that is intentionally following the path of the nerve. Like that's the whole crux of the conversation. And like, the reason that I like to look at these really popular approaches like neurodynamics and look at the theoretical underpinning and challenge it when there's really not any evidence to prove that is how it works or that is why the intervention could give someone relief. It's not to just debunk for the sake of debunking. It's to try and set clinicians free a little bit. Because if you're under the impression that someone's dealing with radicular pain because the nerve is stuck, so now we have to floss it and then get it unstuck and then it'll feel better, and you're really hamstrung by that mechanistic understanding, what happens when that doesn't work very well? Because we don't see these nerve glides, and like that review reflects this as well. They can give some relief and they can feel good, but so can, we know that across the board with repeat movement that can have an analgesic effect. And it doesn't seem to be more effective than other exercise-based interventions. So when that's the case, if you're so stuck on this idea that a radicular pain complaint is due to a stuck nerve and you have to get it unstuck, and then you try it and then it doesn't work all that well, like, what are you going to do next? And this is my whole rationale behind pushing back on those theoretical underpinnings, is that you don't have to get stuck on that one way to move the nerve, and you might not even have to do it at all. Like I said, I treat tons and tons of radicular pain cases like that. It's so weird because that's not the most common pain complaint you'll see, but those are the people who are like booking with me a ton, and I'm working with them all the time. And I'm never using this intervention because I don't buy into the theoretical underpinning. So I don't feel like I have to use it because I'm not under the impression that the nerve is stuck and needs to get unstuck. And this is the same thing we see with like spinal manipulation. If people are under the impression that parts of your spine, the movement gets restricted or the bone goes out of place. Again, they're buying a little too much into the mechanism and not caring enough about the effectiveness. Then it's like, when you do that and it doesn't get the outcome that you're hoping for, if you still think that's the problem and that's the fix, now you're kind of stuck and you've put yourself into a box with that intervention, and you don't have any other ways to fix that underpinning mechanism. Like, what are you going to do? So that's why it's like, when we see these mechanisms not having a large body of evidence to legitimize them, which again, across the board is kind of the theme with musculoskeletal health, it's a good reason to not get so stuck with one type of intervention or be so married to something like nerve flossing or spinal manipulation and whatnot. But yeah, that is what, like, when you look at the evidence, that is what we see. Like, it does have that type of small temporary analgesic effect, but so does all other type of repeat movement interventions. And at the end of the day, when you look at nerve glides for what they are, it is just low load repeat movement. And like, sometimes I look at that and I think it's always a good question to ask when you see something that seems to have some type of small effect for a pain complaint. You should also ask, okay, maybe it's the nerve getting unstuck, but what else could explain what I'm seeing? Part of what might make people feel better when they're prescribed nerve glides and nothing else is you just took them out of any of their other high demand activities that might be provocative, and now you're giving them something very low load. Like, yeah, if I've got, carpal tunnel and I'm in a bowling league, and you take me out of bowling and give me nerve glides, is my carpal tunnel now feeling better because of the nerve glides you gave me getting the nerve unstuck? Or is it because now the only movement that limb is getting is these low load, low intensity, repeat nerve flossing, belly dancing movements instead of like whipping a bowling ball down the lane? Maybe it has more to, like, there's load management baked in to any of those type of low intensity interventions. And to me, that makes a lot more sense for why people might experience relief, as opposed to, oh no, the nerve was stuck and we got it unstuck because we flossed it. You know what I mean?
100%. Yeah, it's there. All of those positions are, as you said, low load, low velocity,
Yeah.
low threatening positions. They're either seated, standing, maybe laying down. The concern, multiple layers you've already touched on, is what people are saying they think is going on or what patients end up believing they have to do to get better. And then let's say you do use that, and we're not telling people not to perform those, but to think as to why maybe it'd be beneficial. But then how do you go from that low load, low velocity, low intensity activity back to the demanding or provocative task? Like you said, how do you get someone from a, nerve glide or nerve slide all the way back to bowling or all the way back to high level sport? Or even just day-to-day activities? That's the issue of like, okay, maybe it desensitizes or creates some, calming down sensation briefly, but then what are the next steps to get back to the thing? And if it's just the assumption that this is going to cure it, and then they can immediately go back to the provocative task, then
that would probably be a recipe for a good flare up, right?
Yep.
And this is where, like, I think our focus really should be, is if what might be going on really is just inherent load management baked into it, maybe we should just focus on the load management part, and maybe we don't need to floss their nerves. Like, maybe we could skip that step. And now you're getting into what my treatment in a lot of these radicular pain cases actually looks like, which doesn't involve any nerve glides or neurodynamics, and just involves looking at the stuff that's provocative for them. I always ask the question, if you were out of pain tomorrow, what would your life look like and what would you be doing differently over the next several weeks? So I'm looking at, like, what do we need to get them back to? And then I'm just thinking about how can we work around those provocatives within whatever their normal is, and how can we try and recreate that level of normalcy to the best of our ability without it being excessively provocative. Like that's where I think the focus should be. And the other one thing I want to throw out quick too is the other problem I have with the nerve glide thing is when we do see papers showing it has an effect, it tends to be a small effect and it tends to be temporary and short term. It doesn't seem to be conducive to any sort of meaningful long-term outcomes. And what we know about radicular pain, radiculopathy, nervy type shit is that it tends to be a long-term game. So if our focus is on an intervention that is really just hinging on temporary bouts of pain relief, we're kind of setting the wrong expectation for recovery, getting people so focused on the day-to-day of how they're feeling and not really setting them up to realize like, hey, this might stick around for a while, and it wouldn't be weird if you were still in this situation 12 to 18 months from now. And those are probably the conversations that are more important, where the focus needs to be as far as timelines go, rather than trying to, floss a nerve, get temporary pain relief, and be like, look at it's working. I think that just kind of skews the focus in the wrong direction as far as a prognosis goes too.
Yeah, I'm really glad you mentioned that. I think Mark and I are going to have a conversation within the next few months on the concern of this like test retest approach that a lot of clinicians are taught with.
Did you see my video that I did on the whole? Oh my god, I did a smackdown on like the whole test retest trick with how like if you test something, then have a distraction and then retest again, you'll see short-term improvements in whether it's flexibility or strength. I've even seen people do it with like balance and coordination, and how that's probably just a really temporary nervous system adaptation that you could achieve just by repeatedly doing the thing, which is what ends up happening because they end up retesting you like 4 to 5 times and you just get a little better at the tests. But then what they'll do is they'll say, no, the distraction or whatever you did between the tests is what caused the improvement in the test as you kept retesting. So that's what our treatment needs to be. I did a full video on that. So that would be a good thing for you to Mark to fit into your whole test retesting, because it is kind of on the same theme. But yeah, I cut you off there. I don't know
totally.
what we were
No worries.
talking about.
Yeah, I did watch that video that you're talking about that you made. And it's just puts more pressure on the clinician to feel like neurotically, I need to create this short-term relief or relief within a session as opposed to.
And you're setting yourself up for a losing battle if that's what you're going to be doing when managing these nervy type things. I mean, like that, these are hard cases. And they, like I said, when you look at the natural history across the board for this type of stuff, it tends to be a long game. So if you're putting all this pressure on yourself to make all these short-term changes all the time and nerve floss the shit out of them every time and hope that it gives relief, I mean, like they're probably still going to be in this position 8 months from now, and somebody's going to be a lot less excited about that temporary relief when they're on month 8 versus when they were in month 1 and you did it the first time. Like now you've done it 100 times and they're still in this position. You want to spend more time setting them up for the long game, I think.
Yeah. To that, if you do have a consultation yourself, or if you were to recommend a conversation that clinicians can have with patients, you're sitting down with someone who you're trying to create a foundation of expectations on what does this look like? You're having nervy symptoms. It's super context dependent, depending on the patient and the severity of it and, whatever it is. But generally, what are your big things that you want to initially set? You've already mentioned time, so you can still include that. But what kind of that is initial conversation look like of, okay, they're having radicular or radiating symptoms. What do I really want to get across? And then what do I want to establish as like, these are the key metrics or things that we want to track over time to begin this kind of plan of care.
All right. I can feel myself. I'm about to go in a whole bunch of directions. So try and rein me in if you need to. But yeah, I'll get into the communication stuff and I'll probably just I'm sure I'll start just spilling into what my management looks like a little bit too, but we'll just see what happens here. Man, there's so many things. So the first thing I want to let somebody know, like you said, is time, and let them know, hey, first of all, time does seem to have a good effect on these things. Like the prognosis, generally speaking, is still quite good. The probability of someone getting better eventually is still pretty good when we're looking at radicular pain cases, but I always describe it as like that pissed off ex. They tend to hold a bit of a grudge, so it might be here for longer than, the typical ache and pain that you see. Like a lot of people are used to musculoskeletal stuff going away and taking care of itself within a matter of weeks, 4 to 6 weeks or less. This is not that. For some reason, these tissues tend to get pissed off a little bit longer than others. And so, like, it wouldn't be weird if we were still here 12 months from now, 18 months from now. And that's not necessarily a cause for panic either. Another talking point that I have with a lot of patients is about a lot of people are looking for the needle in the haystack, and they're like, what's the magic bullet treatment that's going to solve this? And I like to let people know up front that there really doesn't seem to be one. So you can take that pressure off yourself right away too. And, when you're 9 months into this and things aren't dramatically better, don't start getting nervous and feeling like, oh, maybe I'm just missing that one treatment that would have solved this all. It's probably not out there. Your best bet is still probably time. And you probably need more time than it's been given, even though it's been a number of months. So I like to put that out there too, that there is no one particular treatment for radicular pain that seems to work really, whether we're talking about injections or some type of exercise or whatever. We just don't have a lot that treats it better than time itself and letting it just run its natural course. So I like to get out in front of that. I like to make the distinction for people between radicular pain and radiculopathy. I think that's super, super important. And you a lot of times use that as a reassurance piece, because we know the radiculopathy bucket is probably a much smaller percentage of the people we'll see. Most people won't fall into that category. So I'll tell them kind of what the difference is between the two. A lot of people with radicular pain. So, and if for listeners who don't know, there's a great paper by Bogduck, who, and you should definitely link this in the podcast, but there's a great paper by Bogduck that explains really well the difference between radiculopathy, radicular pain, and referred pain. Basically, the way I explain it to patients is everybody who's got radicular pain or traveling nervy type sensations thinks they have a pinched nerve. Odds are they don't. You can have radicular pain without the nerve being pinched or compressed in any sort of clinically significant way. When the nerve does have pressure on it or it is compressed, that's when you start falling into the radiculopathy bucket. And there are objective clinical signs that we will see that will indicate for us this isn't just radicular pain. The nerve isn't just sensitive, because that's what radicular pain means. It just means painful nerve, sensitive nerve. If it's a radiculopathy, there are objective clinical signs that might give us a hint that, hey, it's more than just a sensitive nerve. There's actually pressure or compression on the nerve, changing the actual functional output of the nerve. So we start to see things like strength losses and losses in reflex and changes in even like things like muscle atrophy and things like that. And if we don't see a lot of those objective markers, we're just dealing with the pain, maybe the pins and needles and numbness, sensitivity, that kind of stuff. Then we probably fall more into this radicular pain bucket. And I think that is a really important distinction to make, because that does change management options. Like, for example, if you have a lot of clear and obvious signs of radiculopathy, the nerve roots being compressed, like something like a microdiscectomy, which is probably our best spine surgery when it's actually clinically indicated, that becomes an option for people. And like when it's clinically indicated, and actually like appropriately applied, it can make a big difference in those actual radiculopathy cases. So that's why I think it's really important for people to make the distinction, and they don't end up, on a surgeon table with what's actually just radicular pain. And there's no evidence to suggest that we're actually dealing with mechanical compression, and they're about to have a procedure that's meant to go in and remove mechanical compression that's not actually driving the problem. So I do spend a little bit of time on that too, making the distinction for patients and letting them know overall you'd probably rather be in the radicular pain bucket than the radiculopathy bucket, because the radiculopathy bucket does suggest that there is actual damage to the nerve. If we're just in the radicular pain bucket, it's much more likely that the nerve has just become sensitive for a variety of reasons. But overall, although it is sensitive and although the pain is wild and weird and feels much different than your everyday aches and pains, the nerve is still safe, healthy, intact, and poking into those symptoms is not at all an indicator that you're pinching the nerve harder, that a structure is pushing on the nerve more, that you're damaging the nerve or causing yourself nerve damage. It's just a sensitive nerve and you're doing something that it's sensitive to, but not necessarily an indicator that you're harming yourself or setting yourself up for what's going to be a spine surgery. That's a big distinction. The analogy I actually use with patients a lot is I tell them to think about it like if you have a paper cut and you put vinegar on the cut, that is really irritating for that cut, but that's not making the cut deeper, wider. It's not resetting the cut's healing process. It's not putting you back to square one. It's not changing the recovery timeline of the cut. It's just irritating it quite a lot. And that's kind of like what poking into pain is with radicular pain as well. It's not indicative of the health of the nerve or where you're at as far as a recovery timeline or if you're damaging it. It's just vinegar on the paper cut essentially, and it's not necessarily harmful, although it is pretty sensitive. So those are a few of like the main talking points that are super, super important to me. I don't know if you have any of your own that you like giving people.
No, that was really good, and thanks for giving us that resource. Another one that I was going to add was Tom Jessen. We had a podcast with him, but his book, Understanding Sciatica, the first either chapter or two discusses what is the difference between radicular pain, radiculopathy, what is this umbrella of sciatica, what is referred pain.
How did I do with that? Did I miss anything on that?
No, you crushed it. Yeah. No, that was great. Unfortunately, I don't think they did a good job, at least in my school, differentiating radiculopathy versus radicular pain.
I would say 90% of the people I graduated with have no idea that there even is a difference. And that's massively important to understand the difference because it literally changes management, like in a big way.
Totally. I want to dive a little bit different into the radiculopathy. Let's say they are having motor symptoms or motor deficits and you're consulting with them. What is kind of your discussion on when to decide on surgery, and what would the things be that you would potentially kind of lean towards that as an option?
Well, since I can't do a lot of like the manual muscle testing and stuff like that because I am remote, I'm a little bit quicker to recommend a surgical consult, especially because I have seen papers that indicate that when there does seem to be a radiculopathy, and if it's developed recently, like it's probably better to get them, like if it is actually indicated for something like a microdiscectomy, it is better to get them on the table in a more timely manner than to sit around and twiddle our thumbs and be like, should we think about elevating this to a surgical consult or not? It's probably better to expedite that process. So I'm a little bit quicker to make those recommendations when I am seeing a lot of those objective measures of nerve root compromise. Yeah, I think that's kind of and I also will tell people, because a lot of people don't take this step or aren't aware of it, but to actually like have a nerve conduction study done, that is definitely worthwhile to determine if the nerve is actually damaged or healthy or not, rather than just getting the MRI to see if there's a disc injury or a facet arthrosis or something. That nerve conduction study is a good way to tell if we've got a surgical candidate or not.
Outside of having a discussion around differentiating whether they're dealing with potentially radiculopathy versus radicular pain, timelines, what else are you trying to establish and educate on in that initial consultation? Or just, down the road, you may not be able to get to it, but what are the big hitters?
Yeah, I think I've touched on most of the education stuff, but we can go into some of the management stuff. So like the way I educate on what management should look like, right? So I tell people, we'll stick with the radicular pain bucket, because again, most of the time with radiculopathy, I am having them have a surgical consult before I go any further and determine if you're a surgical candidate or not before I take this and run with it. So let's say it's just radicular pain. I've already told them that it could be a long haul thing. Like even my business partner, Jake Harden, who like he's still dealing with his radicular symptoms, and he's like 2 years plus at this point, right? So, I mean, his situation is definitely better by a wide margin than it was, but what ended up leading to that outcome? Just the time that passed. So I let people know up front, could be a long haul. Ultimately, it's going to be time that makes the biggest changes. So while we're waiting for time to take care of this, we want to, and this is what management is essentially for me, we want to try and recreate normalcy for you and make sure that as we're waiting for time to run out the clock, we want to make sure we keep your life as much on the rails with this as possible. Because especially when you start reading a lot of the qualitative studies around radicular pain, it's really easy for people's lives to get totally thrown off the rails with this because it is such a disarming, scary, weird sensation. And people think they've got something really, really, really wrong. And so the thought of poking into pain or the thought of engaging with usual activity when you've got that type of sensation going on, that can be a real non-starter. So I let people know while we're waiting to run out the clock, we want to try and recreate normalcy for you as much as possible. And a lot of times that involves load management and modifying movements and finding less provocative alternatives to things that you would normally be doing so you can still keep up with your normal stuff, but maybe just do it in a little bit different way so you can actually enjoy doing some of those things rather than just being in scintillating pain the entire time. So like a good example, like this is a conversation I have all the time, and I've even made videos showing a bunch of examples of how I do this. But like, let's say somebody tells me if they were out of pain tomorrow, what's the first thing they would do? They'd get back into the gym again. I'll tell them, okay, well, we want to keep your life on the rails. And if on the rails means you're in the gym training at a high intensity and on a consistent basis, we want to keep you doing that while we wait for time to take care of this radicular pain problem. So how can we do it? Let's say it's radicular pain that follows the path of that sciatic nerve, right? So most of the time that's going to be irritated by a lot of hip hinging movements. That's going to be the movement that puts the most tension on the nerve. So what can we do to try and use that information to get the person back into the gym? Well, a lot of gym exercises involve a lot of hip hinging. So, but I can get creative and look at all those exercises and say, how could I get this person doing this exercise at the intensity they want to, without putting them in that hip hinge position, without putting a ton of tension on the nerve? How can I actually get creative and get that done? So like a ton of examples, like if somebody wants to do a bent over row, that's a hip hinge. I could cut that out and put an incline bench press under their chest and have them straighten out their legs, and they're doing a chest supported row instead. If they want to train their hamstrings, if the seated hamstring curl is too aggravating because they literally get into that like slump posture to put their feet over the bar of the hamstring curl, I might swap that out for a prone hamstring curl. If it's too painful to get down to that prone position, because that getting down into that position will involve a lot of hip hinging, I might swap that out for a Nordic, because with a Nordic, you can keep your torso and your hips straight without a lot of hip flexion. We can train their hamstrings that way. Same thing with, let's see, what are some other examples of ways I've cut out that hip hinge? Sometimes, like another one, a tricky one could be like if somebody wants to deadlift or train their posterior chain, that can be tough because it's hard to do that without hip hinging. Sometimes it's a little bit less provocative to lower yourself into that hip hinge position than it is to push yourself into it. Like if you're doing a deadlift or an RDL, you're pushing yourself back into that hip hinge. If you're doing like a glute bridge, for example, or maybe a glute ham raise, you're lowering yourself into that hip hinge, which allows you to control a little bit more how deep into it you go, and you're not pushing yourself into it. It's a little bit more passively hip hinging. That might be a little bit more tolerable for them than like a deadlift, for example. And then like with a squat, there's ways I can manipulate it so that it's a less hip hinging type squat and more of a knee dominant movement. So I could elevate their heels up and I could switch them to a goblet squat. And that way their squat's a little bit more straight up and down and moving through the knees and less through the hips. I've had a lot of people where I can get them, like they can't quite do like a barbell back squat because it's too hip hinge heavy. But if we switch to a goblet with their heels elevated, it keeps them up and down enough with less hip hinging that they can maybe tolerate that more. And it's just kind of repeating this process again and again until we've essentially recreated the intensity of their workout and we can train all the muscle groups they want to. But now it's at least enjoyable for them because they're not in quite as bad screaming pain the whole time because we're working around a lot of those positions that put tensions on the nerve. And that same principle would apply to radicular pain, regardless of where it's at on your body. You could do the same thing, even if it's not following that sciatic nerve pattern. Another one I see is like for runners, sometimes just the impact of running is really, really irritating. So we can cut that out with something simple like an elliptical. And I like ellipticals, or even another one I've done is like a recumbent bike rather than just a normal stationary bike. Because with the recumbent bike, you can lean back and you've got a smaller degree of hip flexion in this position versus if you're up on the stationary in this position. And then like I said, I like stuff with handles too, because it allows you to hang on to, like with an elliptical, you can hang on to it and it's easier to keep yourself more upright and less of this forward lean, which will have more of that hip hinging, hip flexion type movement and put tension on the nerve. And then with the elliptical, you're taking the impact of the foot strikes out of it too. Sometimes we can recreate some of the endurance demands of their training, or at least keep their fitness levels up and not have that decline so much because now they can't run because it's too painful. We can recreate some of that stuff. And again, the whole purpose of all of that is not to treat the sciatica. It's to treat like their life basically, and not let their life get so thrown off the rails. At least we can keep them fit and keep them exercising and get all the physical and mental benefits of that and not have that taken away from them by the pain problem so much.
And that, I'm assuming, looks very similar to if it was a muscular strain or a tendinopathy. It's like you're still finding and adjusting positions and loads that they can tolerate, but you're not hiding or completely taking a lot of things out for a long period of time. It's like, let's experiment, let's see where you're at right now, and then over time, at least with the nerve stuff, as time progresses, let's reintroduce these things and see how they're tolerated.
That's a good distinction, because when I'm doing this and I'm modifying work, like let's say it's back to that sciatica pattern example, when I'm modifying all their workouts to get them back in the gym and I'm cutting out all of this hip hinging, cutting out all these positions of high nerve tension, I'm not doing it as a permanent measure. And I let patients know right away, this is just to get you through. And when the timeline is complete and you're out of this situation, even before then, like even if your tolerance is just improved enough, we want to put that hip hinging back in, because you need to be able to hinge at the hips to live life on earth as a person. So it's okay to have tension on that nerve. It's okay to go into those positions. This is just a temporary measure to give you this part of your life back while we wait for time to keep lowering the sensitivity and get you out of this. And then as that process unfolds, we'll put you more and more back into those positions and get those positions back. So that's a good distinction too that you made. It's a temporary change. It's not never hinge at the hips again or never put tension on this nerve again.
Is there anything, since you've almost been in practice for 4 years, is there anything that has changed for you that early on you experimented with and that you've just had enough reps where you're like, I've tried implementing this with enough patients, this isn't going well, or things more recently, or like these adjustments make more sense? What has evolved over the past 4 years for you?
So specific to the radicular pain stuff, I used to take a similar, maybe more drawn out, because like a lot of the stuff I'm seeing is chronic pain, and a lot of the approach I'm taking is centered around this whole graded exposure model we talk about all the time. And I used to apply a more drawn out version of that to radicular pain cases too. I've moved away from that and gone more towards what I'm talking about now, which is work around the symptoms while we wait for time to resolve it, rather than work into and work through them. Just because I don't know how much benefit there is to gain from intentionally poking people into their radicular pain symptoms. And I don't know how much because we always talk about like we're doing the exposure thing to build tolerance to the thing. Sciatica and radicular pain seems so time contingent to me that I don't know how much tolerance there really is to build. And I don't know how much upside benefit there is to taking that graded exposure approach to those cases. So it is a little bit different for me now that I work around it more now before I used to try to work through it, but I just kept seeing over and over again. It's such a different type of pain, and it's so debilitating at times when you flare people. And that work through it and exposure approach, like, you are running the risk of more flare-ups with that. And when you're doing it with a radicular pain case, nothing's easier to flare than radicular pain, at least in my experience. And sometimes those flare-ups just aren't worth it because they can be devastating for people. And they can send them into a massive spiral of panic. Not because, like, you can educate them till you're blue in the face, but like, that education tends to go out the window when they're feeling those symptoms because they're just that disarming. So I tried the work through it thing for probably a year and a half, and I just kept moving further and further away from it because it just didn't seem like we were getting much upside benefit from it beyond just letting time pass. So I was like, okay, I don't need to keep throwing people into these debilitating flare-ups if it is so time contingent. Let's just work around it and focus more on giving them their life back and less on trying to build their tolerance to these positions while the timeline is still active. I don't know if that made sense or if I had to clarify that at all.
No, that does. And I think when we had Jacob on the second time, he touched on something similar, and it's
Yep.
I'm not forcing an adaptation, especially with these more nervy things. And that is potentially a little different than your pain tolerance thresholds or kind of your
100%.
symptom thresholds for something more muscular or tendinous in nature, where there may not be this prolonged symptom response. Maybe it's aggravated during the exercise, but within a few hours or 24, 48 hours, you're like, oh, I've kind of returned to baseline. Whereas, like you said, this may be prolonged, and it may just not be worth it.
Yeah, and the flare-ups might fuck their whole week, which sometimes just really isn't worth that exposure type approach. Because again, like, the upside, I don't know that there's more upside to exposure versus just running out the clock. So that is a change and a shift I've made. And that's something me and Jake talk a lot about because he partners with me on that mentorship program. We co-lead it. And that's something that he and I talk a lot about when we start getting into radicular pain management. Is this might not actually be, like, although it fits the timelines of some of those chronic pain cases, this might not be an exposure type case. It might be a work around it and restore normalcy much more so. That's where my head's at right now. And I can't think of any good studies that have really shown that exposure approach to be anything special for those cases too. Not aware of that.
Anything else that you want to touch on or you feel like we haven't chatted about yet on this topic as a whole?
Man, I don't think so. Again, I think it's worth reiterating that, like, nerve glides and neurodynamics are not wrong to do. Like, again, you can get that analgesic effect, but I think it's just important for people to realize, like, the mechanistic underpinning is not proven. And there's other ways to rationalize why someone might get relief. We've got a body of literature that shows repeat movement can be analgesic. And look, nerve glides are repeat movement, right? And we've also it's also obvious that, like, if you are decreasing the load and the intensity of a painful body part, it can start to feel better. And what are we doing with nerve glides? We're decreasing the load and the intensity of movements with the painful body part. Like, there's just other ways to rationalize why they might help. So use them if you like them. Use them if you want to use them, because they're accessible for people. You don't need equipment to do it. They're pretty easy to teach most of the time. They fit a wide demographic. A young patient can do it. An old patient can do it. So, like, they have maybe their place, and you can do them, but just realize you don't need to be hamstrung to them because it's not your job to get the nerve unstuck. We don't know if that's what drives outcomes. And realize that there's probably more you should be doing to maybe focus more on restoring normalcy, because they could be in this situation for a long time. So don't feel pressured to solve the problem with nerve glides. You can maybe use it if and, like, the other thing I would do too is, and this fits into that whole bucket of, like, symptom modifier type interventions, which is where I would put nerve glides. Anything that's meant to just give temporary relief, whether it's repeat movement or massage or spinal manipulation or needling or whatever. Realize that if it works and you get a response, fine, use it. But if it doesn't, like, you can just let it go, because again, it's not what's going to drive the recovery. Time is probably what's going to drive that. So you don't have to hang on to those things tightly. just test it out. If you get a positive response, leave it in place. But there's probably a more that you could be doing for the person. And the way to elicit that information, or the way I do it, is if you were out of pain tomorrow, what would be different for you and what would you be doing differently? Okay, let's try and recreate that now and find ways to manipulate nerve tension within the context of these different activities and exercises that are valuable for you, and put you back into that so that we can at least keep that in place while we're waiting for the timeline to sort of resolve itself. I think that's most of what I would say about all this, and I hope I'm not forgetting anything.
Yeah, that was a lot and that was great. I don't think there's anything that I feel like we need to add on for this discussion, and you hit the things that I wanted us to discuss. And reiterating it again, same thing with just like, chronic or acute low back pain. It's freeing as a clinician and a patient to know, oh, I don't have to do this one thing. There's so much experimentation that I can have with movement and with exercise. And as long as I kind of know what aggravates it, and I can move around that and find other things to explore, there's so many options. And that
is the biggest thing, because I get so much pushback, and people are like, oh, you're a nihilist, you don't think anything works, or oh, you're just debunking this for the sake of debunking. It's like, no, I'm debunking it because I don't want people to think that they have to do things that way when it's not really seeming to be a whole lot more effective than other interventions, and it doesn't seem to be what drives outcomes. It's meant to be freeing when we poke holes in those unproven theories. It's not meant to be, oh, nothing works, or oh, this doesn't do that either. That's the perspective that I hope people have when they see us actually asking these type of questions. So those are questions everyone should be asking all the time. So yeah.
Anything else you want to promote? We're going to link all of the courses and information you have, but anything before we call it, Aaron?
Yeah. The mentorship program is my big thing right now. That's dominating a lot of my time. And it's a very broad program. I mean, me and Jake walk through every inch of our clinical approach, from the patient history taking in the intake to patient communication and pain science education, and getting into, exercise prescription across a really broad spectrum of conditions. And we even talk business stuff with people who are trying to start their own practices. And it's a really wide ranging program. Enrollment is open right now. So I think by the time this podcast goes up, enrollment will probably be closed. But basically what we do is we open enrollment for 2 weeks, and then we run a 6-week mentorship program with the cohort that signs up. And then we reopen enrollment again. So it will open up again. That's the biggest thing. And then I've also got my telehealth course, which is always available because that's all pre-recorded. And you can get all of that stuff just linked in my social media bios. The mentorship program is for whether you work in person or remotely. It's for anyone helping people with pain who want to approach things the way that we approach things. And then the telehealth course is for anybody who's interested in just giving online services to people in pain in some capacity, whether it's going fully online or making a hybrid model where it's part of your already existing in-person practice. So that's kind of the distinction between the two. But yeah, give me your money, people. I freaking need it. Okay. I need better Wi-Fi.
That's right. Yeah. I don't know how this video is going to turn out, but when we recorded initially with Aaron, he was recording on potato. It's a year later and he's still recording on a potato. So we'll see what happens.
I'm in a new house though.
You're in a house. So
stepping up. It's the same potato, different place.
That's right. All right, man. We'll call it there. Thanks again, Aaron.